The sound hit first, sharp, sudden, impossible to mistake. Then came the sting, hot across my cheek, and the hush that rolled through the boarding tunnel. Dozens of eyes turned toward us, some wide in disbelief, others narrowing as phones lifted into the air. The man in front of me, crisp uniform, captain's stripes, stood with his palm still half raised, like he wasn't sure whether to double down or back away. My jaw tightened, not from pain, but from the knowledge that his career had just shifted onto a track he didn't see coming. No yelling, no chaos from me, just silence. The kind that makes people realize they've stepped off solid ground without a parachute. A passenger 2 rows back muttered something under their breath. Another took a slow step forward, recording steadily, eyes flicking between us. The pilot's lips twitched, some mixture of arrogance and unease creeping in, but he didn't drop his gaze. I held mine, letting the moment stretch, letting him sit in the heat of it, knowing something he didn't yet. And when the first security officer appeared at the end of the tunnel, I knew everything was about to shift. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes the truth when it matters most. Drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this community reaches. The officer's radio crackled, and then the pilot made his second mistake. I've worn a badge for more than 2 decades, each year teaching me that control isn't about force, it's about knowing when to speak, when to use listen, and when to simply stand still. I started as a patrol officer in one of the toughest districts in the state, the kind of place where backup sometimes felt like a rumor, and decisions had to be made in seconds. Over the years, I built a reputation for ending confrontations without a single weapon drawn. That reputation carried me through the ranks, detective, captain, deputy chief, until the day I stood at the podium as the first Black woman ever appointed chief of police in our state's history. That moment was bigger than me. It was about every officer who'd been overlooked, every community meeting where people doubted whether someone who looked like me could lead. And still, even with the badge, the title, the responsibility, there were moments, too many moments, when I was reminded that some people would only see my skin before they saw my credentials. This trip was supposed to be different. I wasn't flying to arrest anyone or calm a riot. I was headed to a federal security summit, a closed-door gathering with aviation leaders, counterterrorism experts, and policymakers. We were set to discuss protocols that could keep both passengers and crews safer in the skies. I had my notes prepared, my presentation ready, and a clear plan to push for reforms that had been stalled for years. Even at the airport that morning, the little signs were there. The ticket agent's smile thinned when she saw my ID. A man in line behind me shifted forward like I didn't belong in the priority lane. None of it was new. You learn to carry those moments the way you carry your wallet. Close, but not so tight that it slows you down. By the time I reached the gate, I was already thinking ahead to the summit, running through scenarios, anticipating questions from senators and airline executives. But in the minutes that followed, all those plans, all those expectations would be ripped apart in the narrow, crowded space between the gate door and the aircraft. Not because of a security threat, not because of a passenger disturbance, but because one man in a pilot's uniform saw me as something I wasn't, and refused to see who I actually was. I reached the terminal well ahead of schedule. Flying first class meant I had time to settle in, review my briefing packet, maybe even grab a coffee before boarding. I was in a charcoal gray suit, hair neatly pulled back, shoes polished enough to reflect the light from the gate area. Everything about my appearance said professional. Not that it should have mattered, but in certain spaces, it still does. The gate crew greeted passengers with mechanical politeness, but when I stepped forward, the change was subtle. The agent's smile flickered, her eyes glancing down at my boarding pass as if she needed to double-check something that didn't need checking. "First class?" she asked, like the printed words might be a mistake. "Yes," I replied, my voice even, my expression neutral. A pause, a slight tightening of her lips, then she scanned the ticket and handed it back without another word. Boarding was called in the usual order, and I walked into the tunnel behind a pair of middle-aged men in business suits. The air felt cooler in the enclosed space, the hum of the plane faint in the distance. Just a few steps in, a figure blocked the way. The pilot, standing broad-shouldered with one hand on the wall. "Hold up, we're not boarding yet," he said flatly. Before I could respond, the two men in front of me were waved through with a friendly nod. I waited, expecting him to move aside next, but he didn't. Instead, he stared at me, eyes narrowing, as if he was trying to place me somewhere in a mental category that didn't fit this line of passengers. "Is there a problem?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. "Just following procedure," he replied. His voice carried that clipped, dismissive edge I'd heard before, the one that said the real reason wasn't in the rulebook. Passengers aren't allowed to board until the cabin is ready. Another family appeared behind me, parents with a young child. The pilot shifted to the side just enough to let them through, offering the child a quick smile. They glanced at me as they passed, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. I stayed where I was. "Procedure seems selective today," I said, still keeping my voice steady. His jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to wait. No need to get aggressive." Aggressive. It's a word I'd heard used to reframe calm firmness into a threat. It's the kind of label that can turn a conversation into an incident if you're not careful. My training told me to read the situation, measure the tone, the body language, the audience. But this wasn't about safety. This was about control, and the way he believed he had the right to use it. The line behind me grew longer, passengers shifting impatiently. A few whispered, some pulled out their phones, not yet recording, but curious enough to watch closely. He didn't budge, and I didn't step back. We stood in that narrow space, both of us knowing this was about more than boarding a plane. The hum of conversation from the gate area faded, replaced by the quiet tension of people deciding whether to speak up or stay out of it. The pilot's eyes hardened, his stance squaring as if to make himself larger. "You can either wait here," he said, "or we can call security. Your choice." My pulse stayed steady, but something in the air shifted. A warning that we were only seconds away from crossing a line neither of us could step back from. And then, just as I opened my mouth to answer, he moved closer. His face was just inches from mine now, his breath tight and quick. The space between us felt even smaller in the narrow tunnel, and the eyes of the passengers behind me pressed in from every angle. I repeated the question, slowly, clearly. "What exactly is the security concern with me boarding this flight?" Something in his expression twitched. Maybe it was irritation at being challenged. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't flinch. His answer didn't come in words. The slap came so fast, I barely saw his hand move. A sharp crack echoed in the enclosed space, followed by the sting, sudden hot, blooming across my cheek like fire under my skin. The tunnel went silent. Even the shuffling of feet stopped. For a split second, no one moved. Then I heard a sharp gasp from somewhere behind me, the metallic click of a phone being unlocked, and a woman's voice whispering, "I'm recording this." The man's stance was rigid, his palms still half raised, as if ready to justify himself in an instant, and justify himself he did. "Security protocol," he snapped, his tone dripping with authority. "You were aggressive and non-compliant. I'm within my rights." My heartbeat stayed steady, my training taking over. You learn, over years of tense encounters, that reacting with emotion can be exactly what someone like this wants. Every instinct in me wanted to speak, to call him out in front of everyone, but another part of me knew that silence, right now, was more powerful. The burn on my cheek pulsed with each heartbeat, but I didn't lift a hand to touch it. Instead, I fixed my eyes on his, locking him in place the way I'd done with armed suspects who thought they had the upper hand. His jaw twitched again, maybe from the discomfort of being stared down, maybe from realizing the attention around us was shifting. I could hear passengers murmuring now. "Did he just—" She didn't even move toward him. A man's voice muttered. She was just standing there. The recording phone in the back was now joined by at least two others. One passenger leaned sideways, trying to get a clear shot past the people in front of them. I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting him feel the weight of all those eyes and lenses trained on him. Inside my head, a different kind of conversation was happening. I was running through the implications. If I spoke now, I could escalate. If I stayed silent, I could control the ground we were both standing on. And right now, control was everything. The pilot shifted his weight, glancing past me toward the gate. Maybe he was looking for backup, maybe for a way to retreat without losing face. But retreat wasn't coming. Not anymore. The sting on my cheek was still there, but it was nothing compared to the slow burn in my chest. Not of anger, but of certainty. Certainty that whatever happened next, the balance of power in this tunnel was about to change. So I stood still. No raised voice, no sudden moves, just that same unbroken stare, and the quiet knowledge that I wasn't the one who just made the biggest mistake of the day. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes the truth when it matters most. Drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this community reaches. The tunnel filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and the clipped voices of approaching security. 2 uniformed airport officers appeared, moving quickly toward me. Their eyes locked on the pilot first. A man in uniform, in control of the boarding area, then shifted briefly to me. Without a single question, both veered in my direction, their posture signaling that I was the one they intended to remove. "Ma'am, step back. You need to come with us," one of them said, already reaching for my arm. The pilot's voice rang out behind him, confident and loud enough for everyone in the tunnel to hear. She was aggressive and refused instructions. "She's a security risk to this flight." It was the perfect script for someone counting on his word, outweighing mine. For a few seconds I let it play out. Let them lean on the version he was trying to write into stone. But then a voice from behind cut through the tension. That's not what happened. It was a middle-aged woman, holding her phone up with the camera still rolling. She never even touched him. He slapped her. Another passenger joined in, younger, his phone in hand as well. I got it all from when she first walked into the tunnel. Want to see? The officers hesitated, their hands lowering slightly. Still, their eyes flicked toward the pilot for direction, as if waiting for confirmation before changing course. The pilot didn't flinch. Passengers can say what they want. She was non-compliant and threatening crew safety. That's the end of it. That's when I reached into my jacket pocket. The officers stiffened, the kind of reaction you see when someone isn't sure what's coming out. I moved slowly, deliberately, and produced a small black case. With one flick, it opened to reveal my badge. Not just a badge, my badge, State Chief of Police. The moment hung in the air. Both security officers froze, the reality sinking in. They looked from the badge to my face, back to the badge, and then over to the pilot, who had gone suddenly very still. The color drained from his face, leaving only a tense, rigid expression that was no longer certain of victory. "You're accusing the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in this state of being a threat to crew safety?" I asked, my voice even, but cutting through the tunnel like glass. No one answered. The younger officer's mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to apologize, but no sound came out. Passengers shifted, murmuring, the energy in the tunnel shifting hard and fast. I closed the badge case and slipped it back into my pocket. Then, without raising my voice, I gave the only instruction that mattered in that moment. Escort the pilot to a private holding room. Now. The older officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at the pilot as though hoping for an alternative. But whatever argument the man might have had was gone. The murmurs behind us were growing. Cameras were still up, and every second he stood there was another second his career was bleeding out in public. The 2 officers moved in, one taking position at his side, the other stepping behind him. He didn't resist, but the tightness in his jaw spoke volumes. Passengers watched as the man who had blocked my entry, who had raised his hand against me, was now the one being escorted away. As they led him out of the tunnel, the whispers followed. "Is that really the chief of police? She had a first-class ticket. I saw it. I've never seen a pilot get walked out like that." I stepped aside to let the family from earlier pass into the plane. The mother gave me a quiet nod, a small gesture, but one that said she understood more than she could put into words. The young man with the phone caught my eye and mouthed, "I'll send you the video." Back in the terminal, word was already spreading. A couple at the coffee kiosk were replaying the footage on their phone, the sharp sound of the slap drawing in curious onlookers. At the charging station, a man was typing furiously on his laptop, glancing back at me between keystrokes. Even the gate crew, who had been so quick to scan other passengers through earlier, now avoided my eyes entirely. Over the PA system, the boarding call resumed, as if nothing had happened. But nothing about this day was normal anymore. Not for the passengers who had witnessed it, not for the pilot who was now in a holding room, and not for the airline whose logo had been visible in every second of those videos now multiplying across social media. As I took my seat in first class, I could feel the undercurrent of conversation flowing from row to row. The slap had been a single moment, but its echo was moving fast, bouncing from phone to phone, already out of the terminal and into the world beyond. And I knew, without checking, that by the time we landed, this incident wouldn't just belong to me and the man who'd raised his hand. It would belong to everyone who'd seen it, shared it, and refused to let it disappear quietly. Before we proceed, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes the truth when it matters most. Drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this community reaches. The seatbelt sign hadn't even switched on yet, but my phone was already in my hand. The hum of passengers settling in filled the cabin, but in my row, there was only silence. The kind that follows an event people are still processing. First call, the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office. I didn't need to explain much. The incident was already circulating online, and the name of the pilot was in my report before the receptionist could transfer me. Immediate review, I said. He is not to operate another aircraft until this matter is resolved. No hesitation on the other end, just a clipped acknowledgement. Understood, Chief. We'll issue the grounding order. Second call, my state's Attorney General. We'd worked side by side on policy reform, so I knew he wouldn't take this lightly. I laid out the facts. The public assault, the racially charged nature of the interaction, the attempted misuse of authority. Consider this formal notice, I said. This is now a state-level investigation. By the time I ended the call, a ripple of awareness had moved through the first-class cabin. The woman across the aisle whispered to her husband. A young man a few rows ahead tapped his phone, glanced back at me, then leaned over to speak to the person next to him. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. They knew. They'd seen enough to understand that whatever the pilot's future held, it wasn't another day in that cockpit. A flight attendant passed by, pausing briefly at my row. Her eyes flicked down to my still unlocked phone, then back up to meet mine. No words exchanged, just a quick nod before she kept moving. The quiet respect in that moment was worth more than any forced apology. Somewhere in the terminal, the pilot was sitting in a windowless holding room, likely replaying the last hour in his head. Maybe he was realizing that authority isn't an unbreakable shield. Maybe he was just angry that the person he thought he could humiliate without consequence had the power to end his career with a few phone calls. I leaned back in my seat, not in triumph, but in certainty. Power isn't about yelling the loudest or throwing your weight around. It's about timing. It's about knowing exactly when to speak, and making sure that when you do, the right people are listening. From somewhere behind me, a voice whispered, "That's the chief of police." It traveled forward like a current, each passenger passing it along in lowered tones. By the time it reached the front row, people were looking at me differently, not with curiosity, but with quiet acknowledgement. Outside the aircraft window, ground crew moved with their usual efficiency, but I knew the flight wasn't leaving on schedule. The captain's seat in the cockpit was empty now, and it wouldn't be filled again by the man who had stood in that tunnel minutes earlier. The intercom crackled. A neutral voice announced, "We're experiencing a brief delay in departure. Thank you for your patience." I caught the faintest smirk from a passenger across the aisle. They understood the real reason we were waiting. For me, it wasn't about payback. It was about making sure the message was clear. Authority should protect, not harm. And in that moment, with the hum of whispered conversations and the quiet buzz of my phone confirming the pilot's grounding, I knew the balance of power had shifted exactly where it needed to be. The delay stretched on, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to think. Not just about the man in the pilot's uniform, but about every person who had stood in a similar spot and didn't have the advantage of rank, a badge, or an audience willing to speak up. Incidents like this don't happen in a vacuum. I've read the reports, sat through hearings, seen the footage that never made it to the evening news. Black passengers told to step aside for additional screening, while white passengers walked through without a glance. Mothers asked to prove their children were theirs because the kids' skin tone was lighter. Business travelers pulled out of priority boarding because an employee decided they didn't look the part. I thought about those people now. People who didn't have a title to throw on the table, who couldn't flash a badge and stop the script in its tracks. What if I hadn't been chief? Would I be sitting in a holding room right now, accused of being aggressive because I dared to question an order that wasn't applied to anyone else? Would my name already be in a security database, my reputation tangled in a story I couldn't undo? The truth is, in transportation, especially air travel, unchecked authority is dangerous. When the word of one uniform automatically outweighs the word of a passenger, it leaves a door wide open for bias to slip in. And bias, when given power, doesn't just inconvenience you. It can ruin careers, derail opportunities, and in too many cases, cost lives. I'd sat on panels where these statistics were debated like they were just numbers, but they're not. They're people. Studies show that Black travelers are disproportionately flagged for random searches, both at security checkpoints and during boarding. They're more likely to be removed from flights after disputes that, for white passengers, would end with a simple warning. In 2023 alone, more than 60% of discrimination complaints filed with the Department of Transportation involved race. And those are just the cases reported. I know some will try to frame what happened today as a misunderstanding. They'll say the pilot was just doing his job or following safety protocol. But safety protocols don't require slapping someone across the face. They don't allow selectively blocking certain passengers while waving others through. And they don't give anyone, no matter their title or training, the right to strip someone of dignity because of a personal prejudice. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment, you know the script. It starts small, a look, a tone, a delay that doesn't make sense. Then the label comes, non-compliant, aggressive, disruptive. And once that label is attached, the rest of the story is written for you, unless you have a way to take the pen back. That's why I can't let this slide. It's not about revenge. It's about making sure the next Black woman, man, or child who steps into an airport tunnel isn't left to fend for themselves against someone who believes a uniform makes them untouchable. It's about closing that gap between authority and accountability so tightly that there's no room for abuse to slip through. I've seen what happens when those gaps are ignored. I've read the after-action reports where the only difference between a peaceful boarding and a public removal was the color of the passenger's skin. And I know how many of those passengers went home feeling powerless, carrying the weight of that humiliation long after the flight was over. Today, I had the resources to push back, but I also had the eyes of witnesses, the phones of strangers willing to record, and the truth on my side. Not everyone gets all three. So while the engines stayed quiet outside and passengers murmured in low voices, I decided that this wouldn't just be another personal incident I handled privately. It would be part of a public conversation, one that demanded better from the systems we trust to move us safely from one place to another. And as the plane finally began to taxi, I promised myself something. This wasn't ending when we landed. It was only beginning. Public fallout, 700 words. By the time we touched down, the world outside the cabin was already moving at full speed. I didn't need to check my phone to know the footage had gone viral. I could see it in the way passengers glanced at me as we waited to disembark. Some gave small nods of respect. Others just looked relieved, like they were glad someone had stood their ground in a situation they might have backed away from. The moment I stepped into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted. A man in a business suit paused mid-stride, phone in hand, eyes flicking between me and the video playing on his screen. Two teenagers sitting on the floor near the baggage claim whispered to each other. Then one of them mouthed, "That's her." I could hear my own voice faintly from a video playing somewhere close by. Calm, measured, asking the pilot if there was a problem before his hand struck. By the time I reached the arrival hall, reporters were already gathering, their lenses searching for a shot. I didn't stop for interviews. Not yet. This story wasn't going to be told in sound bites fed to whoever shouted the loudest. Later that evening, my office sent out an official statement. It confirmed my presence on the flight, detailed the pilot's immediate removal from duty, and announced a joint investigation by the FAA and my state's Attorney General. Within an hour, the airline released its own statement, one of those tight, carefully worded responses that acknowledge passenger concerns without admitting fault. It didn't matter. The video had already done the talking. On social media, the story trended under multiple hashtags. Some posts focused on the slap itself, frame-by-frame breakdowns, debates over body language, endless replays of that exact second. Others pulled the lens wider, using the incident as an entry point to talk about bias in aviation and transportation. There were personal testimonies from people who'd been randomly searched, removed from flights, or humiliated in front of other passengers for reasons that had nothing to do with safety. Law enforcement circles reacted too. I got messages from police chiefs in other states, officers I'd trained with years ago, even community advocates who'd once stood across from me in tense meetings. The message was the same. They were glad I hadn't stayed quiet. A few admitted they'd been in situations where they had to swallow injustice to protect their careers. Not everyone supported me, of course. There were predictable comments about following orders and respecting authority. Some tried to frame it as a misunderstanding or suggested that being chief of police meant I should have been more understanding toward a pilot just doing his job. But those voices were quickly drowned out by the sheer volume of witnesses, recordings, and first-hand accounts from the flight. Within 48 hours, the pilot's name was public. His personnel record, once shielded, was being scrutinized. Complaints from previous flights surfaced, some eerily similar in tone to what happened with me. The difference this time was that his target wasn't just any passenger, and the evidence was too clear, too widely seen to bury. The airline moved quickly after that. By the end of the week, they announced his permanent removal from flight duty. Their press release was polished, but I could read between the lines. This wasn't just about disciplinary action. It was about controlling the damage before it grew into something they couldn't contain. What struck me most, though, were the messages from ordinary travelers. Emails, DMs, even handwritten letters sent to my office. Some thanked me for holding my ground. Others shared their own experiences, saying that seeing someone fight back gave them the courage to finally report what had happened to them. A few admitted they'd been too afraid to speak up in the moment, but had carried the memory for years. Walking into work that Monday, I knew the impact had already reached far beyond that boarding tunnel. This wasn't just my story anymore. It had become part of a larger conversation, one that was long overdue. And while the public outrage would eventually quiet down, I had no intention of letting the momentum fade. Because if one moment of visible resistance could shift the balance for even a few people, I knew exactly what had to come next. He thought his uniform made him untouchable. But respect isn't sewn into fabric, it's earned, moment by moment, through the way you treat people when no one's watching. A title, a badge, a set of stripes on your sleeve, none of it shields you from the truth when your actions betray the weight of that responsibility. I've seen men and women in uniform who understood that. They carried themselves with quiet integrity, even when challenged, even when insulted, even when it would have been easier to abuse their authority. And I've seen others, like the man in that boarding tunnel, who believed their position gave them license to humiliate, to control, to decide who was worthy of dignity. That day could have gone very differently if it weren't for the passengers who refused to look away. The ones who raised their voices, who held their phones steady, who didn't let the official version of events replace the truth. I owe them more than thanks, because in that moment, they didn't just stand up for me. They stood up for anyone who's ever been told, by tone or by force, that they don't belong. Carrying yourself with dignity when you've been wronged isn't weakness. It's strength. It's the kind of strength that keeps you from becoming the very thing you're fighting against. I didn't shout that day, didn't match his aggression, because power isn't about matching volume. It's about knowing when to let silence speak louder than anything you could say. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged before they knew who you really were? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters here. And if you believe authority should never be a weapon, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. This community exists because voices like yours refuse to be silenced. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly changes the rules, so the next person who walks into that tunnel doesn't have to choose between their dignity and their right to be there.